From the International Association of Marriage and Family Counselors, I'm Robert Casares, and this is The Reframe. Today's guest is my colleague, Dr. Sam Gladding. Dr. Gladding is a professor in the Department of Counseling at Wake Forest University. He's a prolific author and poet, and an internationally recognized speaker. It's probably not a stretch to say that Sam is a universally beloved figure in the counseling profession. Yet, as he shared with me, he's not been immune from an occasional detractor.
My oldest son came down when he was 16 years old to breakfast, kind of grumpy, frumpy, and lumpy. And he said, "Dad, you know the problem with you?" And I said, "No, Ben, all these years, and I don't know what the problem with me is." And he said, "Dad, you're too optimistic." And I thought, what a great difficulty to have in life. And it was humorous. And life is both has its tragic parts and it has its comic parts. And if we focus too much on one or the other, we do ourselves and the world a disservice.
Welcome to The Reframe. Over the next hour, you'll hear Dr. Gladding's thoughts on leadership, creativity, and the many benefits of humor. He also shares some of his favorite memories from his over 40-year career.
My first 5 years were spent in a rural mental health center. I had a client who was unfocused and just gabbing and really kind of gossiping. Finally, one day, I said, "I just don't understand why you're coming." And she looked at me and she said these words, "You know, talk is cheap." And I said, "Well, it used to be, but I'm doubling your fee." And she obviously got hot and bothered that I was doubling her fee. After she was, quote, outraged, she began focusing on what she was really wanting to do with her own life rather than gossiping.
I began our conversation by asking Dr. Gladding to discuss his interest and involvement in the field of family counseling.
I've had a kind of a love affair with marriage and family counseling. I took my PhD in family relations with cognates in counselor education and psychology. So when I came to my first job in counselor education, they asked me to teach family and couples counseling. And I thought, this is great. So I did, and I became even more involved and started publishing in the area as well as teaching. And this was in the early 1980s before IAMFC came into existence. So I've had a very good experience with couples and family counseling through the years, and it's been better yet being involved with IAMFC. So I've keynoted their conference. I've talked and given presentations at their luncheons. I've written in the family journal, which I dearly love. And I've just really had a good experience with the individuals in the association and with the material, the research and the theories that are a part of couple and family work.
So now you kind of bring that career of experience and those diverse contributions that you've made to the profession into your leadership role as the current president of IAMFC. When you think about that association, what are some of the strengths or some of the notable aspects of that association that you really value?
There's several, and I will probably miss one or two that I really like. But I think we have an excellent journal, and it's pretty much unrivaled in regard to being current and relevant for those within the field of couple and family counseling. I think we do a very nice job, and I would give a shout out to Brian Canfield on this. On international work, we have the Oxford family series and now the Edinburgh, Scotland series during the summer. And so we are international in scope that way. We're inviting in regard to professionals all over the world to contribute to our journal and to our association. So I think we do a lot of things well. Our conference is also quite good, and so I want to underline that, and again applaud the work of Dr. Cheryl Mark in doing that and coordinating that.
And you mentioned in particular that you wanted to give a shout out to the international aspect of the association. And it reminds me of kind of the first experience I had as your new colleague walking down the hallway to your office. And so, at a distance, I see this framed map of the world. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. That's a really nice map. And as I get closer, I see, tons of pins, like, maybe 100+ pins placed in various cities in various countries throughout the world. And I thought to myself, oh, wow, I wonder if that's a map of everywhere the Wake Forest faculty have presented or visited throughout the world. And then as I finally got close enough to read the inscription at the bottom, it said, the world travels of Samuel T. Gladding. And I thought, like, wow, how impressive that, one man has traveled so extensively that I was impressed thinking maybe it was the traveling of 20+ people. So I wonder, as someone who's traveled as much as yourself, how has seeing the world and interacting with different cultures shaped you as a professional?
That's a really good question, because when I think about it, I think I grew up in such an isolated atmosphere, environment. I grew up in a time and place in Georgia where I didn't think there was much of the world outside of where I resided. I certainly did not plan to travel like I have, but what it has made me realize is kind of a little reframe from the poet Maya Angelou in a book she calls Friends. And the lyric goes, "And we are more alike, my friend, than we are unalike." And it has made me see the humanity of others in a deeper way. It's made me very respectful of differences and diversity. It's made me sensitive, I think, to my own self in regard to my interactions with others. And it's made me appreciate what people from various cultures contribute to the world, and made me celebrate that contribution that others give us to the world and to ourselves and to their fellow citizens.
So that's one of the things that's always kind of struck me about you, is just that relentless curiosity, that whether it's, meeting with an individual or working with colleagues and groups, that there's always kind of that desire to just learn more about what it means to be another person. Where do you feel like that came from, in addition to your travels, throughout the world?
I think that I've been fortunate in that genetically, possibly, I have some tendency to be more of a listener than a speaker. I think also growing up, my parents gave me valuable lessons about listening to others and learning that we have one mouth but two ears. I think I'm also just intrigued with people, person kind, if you will, how individuals are shaped by their environment and how they shape their environment. I truly like individuals. I'm a somewhat social animal, and I enjoy being with others. I'm not sure where it all came from, but I know that it did come, and I keep searching for that answer, but it hasn't appeared yet, except maybe some genetics, some the environment, some just a desire to know people.
And while the motivation or the genesis of, that interest in people may be elusive, it seems like kind of the benefits and the fruits of that have been tremendous. And I wonder how that interest and curiosity about people and desiring to be, an attentive listener has helped you as a leader throughout your career, if that served you well.
I think listening to people serves any leader well. I think it has especially served me well because if we don't know what people need or want, then we can have all the ideas in the world, but they don't do much good. I was struck by my first counseling course. It was on school counseling, actually, and one of the lessons was on needs assessment, that if you're a counselor in an educational institution, one of the best things you can do early on is to find out what people in your environment need or want, and then speak to that and work to help achieve those needs and wants so that they're met. And so I think it all starts with listening, and it all starts with other people rather than our own ideas. We certainly can contribute our own ideas, but it's listening to others that makes things better yet.
So as the current president of IAMFC, in collaboration with those who might be chairs of various committees or other members of that association, what do you feel like are the needs for the 2-year term that you've now assumed?
I think one of the biggest needs is growing the leadership. I hate to say it, but in 20 or 30 years or so, I'm probably going to be pushing up daisies with my ancestors. And so realizing one's own mortality and realizing that one of the best things we can do to contribute to the good in the world is to help others grow and keep a legacy going, then one of my main focal points will be on helping people grow as leaders. I think we also, of course, want to reach out as much as we can that's possible to helping people appreciate how couple and family counseling is practiced internationally as well as in North America. But we want to make sure that we are contributing to evidence-based research on how couples and families act and react, and how we can best help them do well. So those seem to be my main focal points.
Well, those are certainly ambitious goals. And I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, leadership and, what that looks like and kind of what that means for you. And certainly a theme that's come out in what you've expressed today, but also has been very evident in my workings with you throughout the past year at Wake Forest, is certainly like a profound humility. I remember in the first week I worked with you, 2 separate people utter these phrases. He is a national treasure, and then another person said, a prince of a person. And yet, in my dealings with you, you were just the most unassuming, everyday type of guy. What is more specifically your philosophy of leadership, or how do you see humility being a necessary or beneficial aspect of good leadership?
I think a good leader is one who helps others. We're in a helping profession. And so one of the things that I think we need to focus on is not ourselves, but others. It's not about me. It's about, if I can say this, rhymingly. It's about we. And so people are not going to remember us so much as they will what happened and how an association was brought along or how an environment was changed. And so I can't tell you who was the third or fourth president of IAMFC. I can't tell you who the 33rd president of the United States was. But I can tell you some events that made a difference in the lives of people. And whether it's collectively or individually, I think a leader's goal should be to foster positive mental health and positive interactions among individuals and groups.
So one of the first pieces of advice that you gave me, you said to me, try to find a place where you can make a difference, and it doesn't have to be out front. Sometimes the most meaningful contribution may be behind the scenes. And yet now you find yourself out front. What about those people who maybe are not as well established in their career, who may not be in these very prominent leadership positions? I think of younger professionals like myself. What advice might you have for them to encourage them to get involved or to make a difference kind of at a stage in an area of their professional career that would be appropriate and manageable?
One of the things is to listen to yourself about what you're ready for and to be persistent in wanting to do more, but not to be overly ambitious in trying to do too much and therefore being superficial in what you do. I also think, again, kind of checking your altruism level. We check our gas, we check our oil when we're in cars. So what's the motivation behind my wanting to do this? Do I want to be the king or queen of the world? That's kind of a silly analogy, but in some ways, we sometimes get people who let their ambition come before their readiness. And so being ready, doing the menial task, looking at people who are in leadership and thinking about how could I do that better, or how could I do that the same that's really working. I think those are the things that people should look at. Bruce Springsteen has that little lyric that you can't go the distance with too much resistance, but I think you can't go the distance unless you have some persistence and unless you have qualities that are rock solid rather than superficial.
Well, you've now quoted Bruce Springsteen and Maya Angelou, and we're only just getting started. And that brings me kind of to my next topic, is creativity. It seems like in every situation, you always have a funny comment or a quote that's applicable. And I know that creativity is, in addition to family counseling and, say, group counseling, an important aspect of your work. And so when you think about creativity for your own life, what are some of your sources of inspiration?
Wow, there are probably a lot of sources for inspiration for creativity. But I think let me start with one that has come more in later years than early years, and that would be reading the research on creativity. I think that's important because knowing that it's not an inborn characteristic that we have, and it's not genius or it's not intelligence so much, although you have to have a certain amount of intelligence to be creative. I think those are things that I truly value, but those have come in later years. So when I think of creativity, I think of individuals that I have known through the years, whether they were peers or whether they were professionals or whether they were others in the environment that I looked up to and admired, and how and what they did. So I'm trying to think of a specific example. Well, I'll give you an example. My grandfather was named Samuel Templeman, and obviously those are my first two names. And ironically enough, he lived in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where I've resided for the past 28 years. But he lived another place before then, and he once, because this was the 1910s, was pastor of a church, and unfortunately there was Saturday night where there was going to be a lynching, if you will. And obviously he was humanitarian and concerned. And so he went to the sheriff's office where they were trying to get someone out of jail. And he realized that he could not identify people because they were in white Klan robes and hoods. But he looked down and he saw their shoes, and he could recognize a few people who were in his congregation. And so he called them out as well as quoted scripture. And the crowd dispersed. And it was because he looked at their shoes and was creative in recognizing who they were, because people didn't own a lot of shoes back then, that he was able to save someone's life. And I thought that was a pretty creative thing he did.
Oh, absolutely. And that makes me think of, there's some people who might say, is that creativity or is that just quick thinking? And I wonder if there are some misconceptions that you commonly hear about creativity that are intended as critiques, but maybe in your research and in your experience, miss the mark.
Oh, I think there are. I think people sometimes think that if it's new, it's got to be creative, and it doesn't necessarily have to be. And if it's flamboyant, it has to be creative. So I like the definition that creativity is something new, but it's also something useful, and that we stand on the shoulders of others who have been before us. So creativity is not a light bulb, it's an iceberg, and that it stacks up. And so if others have tried to do something and not been successful, or we've tried to do something and not been successful, it's going on to the next kind of work or next project. So we know the computer was a series of trial and error. We know that the light bulb was also Edison, a series of trial and error, and that creativity involves failing as well as succeeding. But the thing it involves also is that people have the persistence to stay with it, and creativity is a social action. So you can't just go to a cave or a monastery probably and be very creative. You have to mix it up with others and find out their ideas as well as your own ideas. It's a matter, again, of listening and assimilating and then creating.
So as someone who's kind of developed your understanding of creativity throughout the decades in collaboration with others in that social interaction, as someone who's rooted themselves in research and contributed significantly to that body of research, a lot of successes. And yet you mentioned in that description that being creative requires failure. I wonder if there are any noteworthy setbacks or failures from your own career that have kind of sparked some of that creativity in your professional life.
There are a lot. One of the things I would say is that initially, when I finished my PhD, I went looking for counselor education opportunities, and it took me like almost 200 applications to get 3 interviews, and the one I really wanted, I didn't get. And but of the 2 that I was offered, I chose the one I thought would be best. And while it wasn't an ideal environment, I just stayed with it, and other things began to develop. I think there's an old adage that people plan and God laughs, and so things happen if you stay with something, or at least it seems that way to me. Serendipity is a part of life. Happenstance is a part of life. Non-events are a part of life, and so sticking with it. I once applied for an editorship of a journal, and it was given to someone who didn't even apply.
Oh, wow.
And, well, okay, just stay with. And so I just kind of laughed and thought, so I just think that part of creativity is staying with things that you really want and desire, and realizing that if you fail, you need to accept it, and you need to go on, and you need to maybe assess it in what was it that didn't happen here, and how do I feel about this? I started off thinking I was going to be a minister, went to divinity school, and found out I was not going to be a divine, let alone minister.
That made God laugh.
It did. And realized that counseling was, if you will, a calling, and in a good way, and that I was well suited for it. So I stayed with it, and have really had a wonderful experience. But a number of setbacks. The first book I proposed was turned down flatter than a pancake because the editor who I sent it to said nobody could write a book like this. And I just said, well, let's just see. And so stayed with it. I think it's not getting discouraged by failure and expecting that we learn a lot by failure. The last thing I'd say on that is my dad used to say 2 things to me. I really love my dad, but he said 2 things to me that really always stand out in my mind. And one was when I'd putz around and be out of focus, he'd call me over and he'd say, you know, you can't be a promising young man forever. You're going to get older, and if you're going to do something, do it now. And the other thing he'd say to me is, give yourself to something great. Give yourself to something better, higher, more noble than you could even imagine. So it's kind of like leave the world a better place. Jonas Salk is quoted as saying that the best thing we can do in life is to be a good ancestor. And I think he is right, and I think my dad was saying something like that to me also, like, don't just putz around with your life. Don't be frivolous. Focus.
So certainly in your exploration of that higher calling, there were those setbacks and those new roads or paths that you took to, get to where you were eventually at, and persistence and creativity have served you well. I wonder how creativity benefited you as a clinician as you worked with clients and sat across from couples or families.
I think creativity has served me well. I started out as a Rogerian, like a lot of people do, and I was pretty much reflective more than anything else, and I like Rogerian theory, although I'm at this point in my life an existentialist. But I remember one client my first 5 years were spent in a rural mental health center after I finished my master's, so it's not like I sprang forth from anything all of a sudden. But I had a client who was unfocused and just gabbing and really kind of gossiping, and I kept wondering, what's happening here? And I'd reflect, and I'd do all the good Rogerian things. And finally, one day, I said, I just don't understand why you're coming, because this is what you seem to be doing, reflecting back. And she looked at me and she said, well, why wouldn't I? In a sense of, and she said these words that made me think. She said, you know, talk is cheap. And I said, well, it used to be, but I'm doubling your fee. And she obviously got hot and bothered that I was doubling her fee. And I said, well, that seems the best, in my own mind, I thought that seems the best thing to do. And she, after she was, quote, outraged, she began focusing on what she was really wanting to do with her own life rather than gossiping about other people. So it was a creative moment where I just said, this is the best thing to do, because no theory is going to change her, I don't think. So, there have been a number of creative moments like that aren't in standard counseling text.
Well, creativity certainly has served you well as a counselor, and I wonder how you integrate creativity into generating ideas for articles. You recently published in the Journal of Creativity and Mental Health an article entitled Scriptotherapy, 18 Writing Exercises to Promote Insight and Wellness. What was the story behind generating that idea?
Failure. When I would get rejection slips, I would think, oh, well, what did I do wrong? And feedback of people who may, I thought, have my best interest in mind, trying to tell me this just isn't publishable. So I started thinking, and I started writing ideas down about when I was successful and when I was not successful, and listening to others when they were successful and not successful. I keep a pen and paper by my bedstand at night, and sometimes I'll wake up and I'll have an idea and I'll write it down. Now, this probably drives my wife crazy, but no, she's actually a very good sport about it. But the long and short is, I thought, lessons learned. What do we know, and how do we know it? And while I might not practice every one of the 18 methods that are in that article, I practice most of them. And I've just learned through the years. It's one great thing about getting a little older. You accumulate a lot of experience as well as a good deal of knowledge, and it can come out in articles.
One of the things that you shared with me recently about creativity is that it's not magic, but it can have magical results. And it sounds like in your creative output and just the process of being a creative person, there have been a lot of setbacks and a lot of pain and a lot of things that could be frustrating, and yet they've been generative. And, you've persisted in plugging away at ideas even if they've initially fallen flat. And it seems like that served you really well in just being a productive professional. Would you have any other insights or advice to share with maybe new professionals who are running into some of those same frustrations and wondering, is this ever going to break in a successful way for me?
I think there's, as you said, or maybe I said, there's no magic in creativity. It's hard work, it's overtime, and one of the things I've found that has helped me has been the creative arts, music and visuals and imagery and pictures, etc. And so I look to those at times about what people did and how they did and how they expressed themselves. But I would say that one of the best things to do is to see how your track record is. Will Rogers used to say, you might be on the right track, but you'll get run over if you're not moving by a train. And so moving and not doing what other people think you should do. But if I can quote Dag Hammarskjöld, one of his best quotes is, "The more faithfully you listen to the voice within you, the more clearly you'll hear what's sounding outside." So listening to the voice within you, I think, is the best thing I could say to someone who's coming up in the profession. And also saying to them, if the voice within you is telling you this is not for you, then listen. It's okay to change vocations. If the voice is saying, keep on, you really like this, then go with it by all means.
That's given me a lot to reflect on, and certainly that resonates very deeply with my own life experience. And so I'd like to go back to some of the funnier things that you've said today, or maybe some of the funnier things you've just said to me in general. You know, you were able to get me to laugh at the idea of your death. And I just think of humor as one of those, great gifts that can add levity to such, difficult times. Where did that humorous aspect of your personality come from? Was that shaped by your upbringing?
I think it was somewhat shaped by my upbringing. My parents would always say, be humble because you have a lot to be humble about. And also, I realized that when I looked at my environment, there were bigger people out there, there were more beautiful people out there, stronger people out there, smarter people out there. And so I realized one of the things that might help me a little is to understate some things, and also to, there are different types of humor. And self-effacing humor is, as long as you don't overdo it, is a good thing to do. It's like Abraham Lincoln being scolded by a woman one time who said, Mr. Lincoln, you're two-faced. And Lincoln replying to her, ma'am, if I were two-faced, would I be wearing this one? He was not the most handsome man around. But realizing that, as the West Coast writer, family therapist Paul Watzlawick says, may be serious, but it's not hopeless. And so seeing what could be, as well as, and being optimistic. My oldest son came down when he was 16 years old to breakfast, kind of grumpy, frumpy, and lumpy. And he said, Dad, you know the problem with you? And I said, no, Ben, all these years, and I don't know what the problem with me is. And he said, Dad, you're too optimistic. And I thought, what a great difficulty to have in life. And it was humorous. And life is both, has its tragic parts and it has its comic parts. And if we focus too much on one or the other, we do ourselves and the world a disservice. So I'm not sure where all the humor came, but I do know I'd rather laugh than cry.
You've certainly, in the feedback I've gotten from your students who then became my students, have made them laugh more than you've made them cry. And something that they said to me one day when you came up in my class was how you conclude most of your classes. And I'd wondered if you'd share that with our audience, because it's something I think about probably on a monthly basis, and it makes me laugh out loud.
Well, I usually end the class with kind of a sign off, and it's kind of like the nightly news or whatever, but I say something like, see you next week, same day, same time, same university.
How long have you been saying that for?
Oh, a long time. I just thought it's people need a certain certainty in their lives to shape their environment, and I just thought it was also kind of funny. I was a football manager early in high school, and the coach asked me to introduce the other managers because he couldn't remember their names. And so I started introducing them like he had introduced the football players, like, here's Ricky, he's 5'7", 130 pounds. He's really good at putting the screws into the helmets. And it just seemed to go from there. To take a light side to life and be an optimist also.
Are there other ways that you instruct your students, or you try and get at some of that deep learning through the use of humor, or through taking a light side to some of the serious work that we do, or the situations where our clients might feel perhaps hopeless?
I do try to take a lighter side. Obviously, I think there's some times where you can't do that. Grief, tragic, really tragic situations. But there's a professor at Johns Hopkins University named Roland Burke, and he has a book on teaching and it's written a good deal about teaching using humor. And one of his books is that professors are from Mars, students are from Snickers. And it's a play, obviously, on the candy. But he basically says humor can help us learn. And so when you think back on some of life's lessons, a lot of them have some humor involved in them. And so I try to occasionally use some humor to emphasize a point or some exaggeration, which is also humorous and role play, to help students learn.
You talk about humor being a way of kind of creating memories or reshaping memories that might be painful and allowing them to be a bit more lighthearted. As you reflect on your career, are there those things that stick out to you as particularly memorable that have shaped your approaches to counseling or to teaching that stick with you to this day?
I think there are notable moments. I'm not thinking of too many of them right now, obviously, but they've been integrated into my conscious and subconscious and unconscious. We'll get all the consciouses there. I remember one day, and I've repeated this to my classes, that you may or may not believe in your unconscious, but it believes in you. And that some of your thoughts and your ideas that are quite good may come when you're least expecting them, or at night when you're dreaming, or just waking up. There have been a lot of mirthful moments, levity, and I've written about that, how much I think it's important. I asked my wife once why she married me. I don't know that you should ever ask your spouse or significant other why they are with you, but...
Unfortunately, I've already made that mistake.
Okay.
We should have recorded this podcast earlier.
Yeah, but she basically said, you make me laugh. You made me laugh. And I thought, oh, okay, that's good, because I really wasn't trying necessarily to do that, but humor attracts people and doesn't necessarily distract from what you're doing unless you just overuse it. And it's like anything. You can overuse food, or you can overuse exercise, and you can overuse humor. But in the right balance, humor, like exercise and food, it's good for you.
Well, you talk about being married, and y'all have been married for over 30 years now, right? Still making her laugh. And I know you've spoken about that being, a great accomplishment, so to speak, of your life? Are there other accomplishments or noteworthy, aspects of your career that you look back on as particularly fond?
Wow. Well, the birth of my children, we have three boys, three joys. They're all young grown men now. I look back on some things that, that have been humorous in my life. Everything from an automobile wreck that didn't kill me, but I thought, oh, that's something. To one of my children having a hospital stay one time, and because he wasn't keeping things down, and the nurse bringing him a 20-ounce Pepsi and saying, if you can drink this and keep it down, we'll let you go. And his taking some sips, and I finally said, Tim, let me see that. And drinking a good deal while he did too, because I knew he was better. I wouldn't have done that otherwise. And realizing it was kind of funny looking back that I was drinking his Pepsi, but also that it let us out of the hospital, and he was just fine.
I love the way that when you reflect on kind of your lifetime and your career, that family was at the forefront. There are so many things that I've heard people say about your accomplishments. He's the family guy, or he's the group guy, or he's the funny guy. But when you talk about yourself, you're the family man. And I think that's a beautiful testament to kind of the work-life balance that you've really tried to strike.
Oh, thank you. I don't think of myself in terms of anything special. But I do think of my family, and I think that's special. And that's the most important thing. Relationships, and relationships with colleagues too. That's important.
Absolutely. So as someone who, has a track record of being both productive and successful as a professional, but also, dedicating a lot of time to being a family man, what was the secret to that? How were you able to accomplish that?
I think it was purposeful in so many ways. I think, if our lives are worth living, they need to be purposeful. We need to have some hierarchy in regard to what's most important, and I always thought family was. My parents were very good in their relationship, and I know they were good models for me. I also looked around. I was kind of late in getting married. People may not realize that, but my parents were so sure that I wasn't going to get married. They kind of gave away stuff that you would normally think they would give you if you were married. I mean, I remember my brother. I had an older brother, and he married fairly young and had children, and they kept the baby bed around for a while, and then they just kind of gave it away, and realizing, he's not going to have children, let alone get married, or anyway, reverse of that. So when I did get married, when I did find Claire, who's my wife, I tell people, as you've heard me say, that I clarified my life, and she was a middle school librarian, and I took her out of circulation.
I haven't heard that part.
I've never returned her. But I thought, I really value this because it might not have happened. And so I think family comes first, and everything else comes second.
Well, I've really appreciated how reflective you've been and kind of looking back on your life and your career and highlighting the things that you've learned and those noteworthy accomplishments. But I'm also curious about the future. Where do you see the counseling profession, or where do you hope the counseling profession to be in, say, 20 years?
Oh, wow. I think the counseling profession has a bright future. Couple and family work has a bright future. Group work has a bright future. Individual counseling, because we are in a time where people are stressing wellness and good mental health. Now, we have a good deal of tragedy in our society also, but one of the best things that's happening, I think, as a whole, but it's happening slowly, is a focus on prevention rather than treatment. And so I see counseling with couples, like couple enrichment or family enrichment, that moving on to a higher plane and a higher status in society. I think counseling also has a lot of good theories, techniques, mindfulness, for instance, that can be used by the local population in almost any environment. It's not mystical. It's not necessarily going back to your childhood and analyzing that, but it's going forth from where you are now and growing. So I think counseling, with its emphasis on prevention, is going to go a long way. I think its emphasis on evidence-based practices is going a long way. There is always going to be a need for treatment. I would never dismiss that. But I think counseling has much more emphasis as a profession on prevention and development and working with young people as well as geriatrics to help them appreciate and do well in life. And I think that's why counseling is going to be one of the top professions around, again, after some of us are pushing up daisies with the ancestors.
Well, when I was preparing for this interview, I came across a poem that you had written that's featured in your book, Creative Arts and Counseling, and you've been certainly a prolific poet. And it touched on a lot of themes that I think have been discussed and reflected in this conversation today. And I was curious if you would read it for us.
Sure. This is a poem. Again, I don't know where all of this came from, except I think being sensitive to others and to oneself, you begin to write some things down, and certainly this is one I wrote down that I hope reflects what I feel and think about leadership and about life. So it goes like this. Amid a cascade of thoughts, reflections flow and, like a river, weave a path through changing vistas where there is room and time for growth. At dusk, I ponder the journey's end, and in the spirit of transformation, I quietly launch forth frail ideas into waters filled with hope and turmoil, conscious I may never see their final forms or substance, yet knowing inside peacefully that others will keep the best on course.
Well, you've mentioned that, what you've done specifically may or may not be remembered, but that you hope that it would be carried on. Is there an aspect of what you've tried to contribute to the profession that you would hope would be maybe that best that others might try to keep on course to continue your legacy?
Well, I think, again, focusing on creativity, on the possible of what can be, is something I would hope counseling would continue to look at, work on. Counseling started, like a lot of other helping professions, much more on treatment than on prevention. But I think creativity is one of those aspects of life that can help people grow and have a good life and appreciate life and be more sensitive to themselves and to others and to the world. And so I hope that focus on creativity does not fade like the sun at the end of the day.
The Reframe is a production of the International Association of Marriage and Family Counselors. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review the show in Apple Podcasts. The next episode of The Reframe will be released on September 4th. Thanks for listening. Join me next month on The Reframe.